All right, so today we're diving deep into a story of international intrigue and, well, let's just say some pretty high-stakes corruption.
Sounds intriguing already.
Oh, it is.
Mm.
We're looking at a Premium Times investigative report. It came out November 13th, 2024, and it's all about Samba Dasuki, Nigeria's former national security advisor.
Ah, yes, Dasuki, appointed back in 2012, if I recall correctly, to tackle the Boko Haram crisis.
Exactly, a pretty critical role.
Absolutely. A huge responsibility, especially given the volatile situation at that time.
But here's where things get interesting, like just days, literally days after Dasuki took office, a U.S.-based couple, the Oshodins, they start buying up all this crazy expensive real estate.
Oh, like what kind of real estate are we talking about?
A $9.5 million mansion in L.A., a $6.5 million home near D.C., all within days of each other.
Wow, that's quite a spending spree.
And get this, they even bought a door that once belonged to Mozart.
A door from Mozart.
Yeah.
Okay, now that's a statement piece, but seriously, this raises a massive red flag right from the start.
Right. I mean, such lavish spending so soon after Dasuki's appointment, it just makes you wonder.
Exactly. Where did this money come from? It's a question that demands an answer.
And that's where the Premium Times investigation comes in. They found this trail of financial transactions, and it looks like they directly linked Dasuki to the Oshodins.
Really? What kind of transactions?
Well, there was an initial transfer, get this, of $270 million, just 2 months into Dasuki's term.
2 months. That's not exactly subtle.
Not at all.
This kind of rapid movement of funds, especially right after someone takes office, it's unfortunately a classic sign of corruption. And not just in Nigeria. We see this pattern globally.
So you're thinking this wasn't just some random windfall for the Oshodins?
It seems unlikely. The timing strongly suggests a premeditated plan, maybe even a pre-existing relationship between Dasuki and this couple.
So there's got to be more to this story.
Definitely. And the Premium Times investigation, they dug deeper, and what they found was a whole pattern of payments from Dasuki to the Oshodins.
Really? What were these payments for?
Well, that's where it gets a little murky. They were often disguised under these vague terms, consulting services, special ops. There was even one for, get this, $12 million for a counter-radicalization campaign.
Counter-radicalization? That's so broad.
Exactly. I mean, it could mean almost anything, right?
But if you connect it to Dasuki's role, national security advisor, the fight against Boko Haram, it starts to feel deliberate.
Like they're trying to hide something.
Exactly. Like they're trying to obscure the true purpose of where these funds were actually going.
Absolutely. And it raises some very serious questions about the potential misuse of public funds, funds that were meant for national security. Were they actually used for their intended purpose? Or was it just a way to siphon off money for personal gain? That's what investigations like this try to uncover.
Holding those in power accountable.
Exactly. Following the money, seeing where it leads.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
I like that analogy. And speaking of peeling back layers, the Oshodin's finances, those tell quite a story. Before that $12 million landed in their account, they only had $50,000 to their name.
Wait, so they went from $50,000 to, what, over $12 million?
Just like that.
I mean, wouldn't that set off every alarm bell?
You'd think so, right? Such a sudden and massive influx of cash, that's a pretty textbook sign of money laundering.
It's almost like they weren't even trying to hide it.
Wait, that's the thing. The methods they use, they might seem blatant, but there could be a level of sophistication here that goes beyond your typical money laundering scheme.
Okay, come with me.
They were using shell companies, for one, to obscure their ownership. Makes it much harder to trace the money back to them.
Sneaky.
And then the choice of real estate, those high-profile, expensive properties in LA and DC, it suggests a strategic move, maybe trying to integrate into a new society, project this image of legitimacy.
Interesting. So it's not just about hiding the money, it's about using it to build a new life. Wow. Okay, so we've got suspicious financial transactions, a sudden influx of wealth, and a lavish lifestyle. This is getting good.
Oh, it gets even better. Remember those 14 additional properties the Premium Times investigation uncovered?
The ones totaling $24 million. Yeah, what about them?
Well, if we take a closer look at the timeline of those purchases, a pretty interesting pattern starts to emerge.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
So these purchases, they started out small, almost tentative, right after Dasuki took office. But as time went on, they got bolder, more frequent, higher value.
Like they were testing the waters.
Yeah, exactly, and gaining confidence as they went along. And this shift in their buying habits, it coincided perfectly with Dasuki's time in office. But once he left, things changed. The Oshodins, they started selling off property.
Almost like they were trying to cover their tracks.
Yeah, trying to shuffle things around, maybe make the money harder to trace.
Makes you wonder, did they sense something was up? Did they think the walls were closing in?
It's definitely possible. I mean, were they just trying to protect their assets, or were they actively trying to hide evidence of something, something more serious?
And this is where those personal ties between the Dasukis and the Oshodins come in, right?
Exactly.
The report mentioned how the Oshodins were guardians for Dasuki's children, and they might have even been involved in building him a house.
Yeah, those are some pretty close connections.
It makes you wonder about the level of trust between them, the shared knowledge.
Did the Oshodins act alone? Or were they part of something bigger, something orchestrated by Dasuki himself?
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing.
Exactly. And then there's that separate U.S. court case the Oshodins were involved in, the one where all those details about their lifestyle came out.
Oh, right. The one with the, what was it, $15 million in jewelry and $1 million drapery.
Yeah, I mean, come on. It's like they were practically begging to be investigated.
It does seem a bit over the top, doesn't it?
Well, sure. But this kind of evidence is actually really valuable in financial crime cases because it shows a clear gap, a discrepancy between their legitimate income and their extravagant spending.
They can't really explain it away.
Nope. And the Oshodins, they claimed huge losses in their Nigerian businesses, but here they are in the U.S. living like royalty.
So it just doesn't add up.
Not at all. It's a pretty classic example of how people use dirty money to finance this lavish lifestyle.
Okay, but here's what I don't get. All this is happening in the U.S., a country that's supposed to have all these anti-corruption measures. How does this even slip through the cracks?
It's a good question. The Premium Times investigation actually mentioned a report by Transparency International, and they highlighted how vulnerable the U.S. real estate market is to this kind of illicit money flow.
Really? But how?
Well, for one thing, the agencies responsible for regulating this stuff, they're often underfunded, and there's this whole culture of secrecy surrounding these high-end real estate transactions.
So basically, it creates these loopholes that make it easy for dirty money to just flow right in.
Sadly, yeah. It's a stark reminder that even the most sophisticated systems have their weaknesses.
So what could be done about it?
Well, for starters, we need to acknowledge the problem. And then, strengthen the systems, close those loopholes, prioritize international cooperation.
Speaking of cooperation, the report mentioned that the EFCC, they appealed to the U.S. Justice Department for help with this case.
Right, they're hoping to use those mutual legal assistance treaties.
The ones that are supposed to make it easier for countries to work together on these types of cases.
Exactly. These treaties are designed to overcome jurisdictional barriers and facilitate the sharing of evidence and resources.
So they can build a stronger case together.
Hopefully. Remember the FIFA corruption scandal a few years ago? That one involved multiple countries, and they relied heavily on these kinds of treaties to bring charges against those involved.
So there's precedent for this kind of international collaboration.
There is, but the big question is, will the U.S. actually cooperate in this case?
It's a good question. It makes you wonder about the bigger picture. I mean, if a case like this, one with, so much evidence can potentially get stuck in all this international legal stuff, what hope is there for, I don't know, less high-profile cases?
Yeah, it's a valid concern. Prosecuting these international financial crimes, it's really difficult. It takes so much coordination, resources, political will, you name it. But cases like this, even if they don't, lead to immediate convictions, they're still important.
How so? I mean, if they're so hard to actually prosecute, what's the point?
Well, they shine a light on things, right? They expose the underbelly of the global financial system. They show us the vulnerabilities, the tactics being used, the people involved, and that in itself can have a deterrent effect.
So it's about more than just getting a conviction.
Yeah, it's about sending a message, letting those involved know that they're being watched, that they could be held accountable.
That they can't just get away with it.
Exactly.
And the Premium Times investigation, they concluded that the Oshodins themselves, they could face legal trouble in the U.S., for money laundering and tax evasion. How likely is that?
It's definitely possible. Remember, the U.S. has a big interest in protecting its financial system, keeping it clean. And the evidence here, especially that gap between their claimed income and their, well, let's call it their lavish spending, that could be enough to trigger a serious investigation.
So even if they somehow avoid consequences in Nigeria, they might not be totally off the hook.
Right. And the fact that the EFCC officially asked for help from the U.S. Justice Department, that adds another layer of pressure. It puts the issue on their radar, you know? They can't just ignore it.
So it all comes down to accountability.
Yeah, the idea that nobody, no matter how rich or powerful, is above the law.
Oh, that's a good thought. So for our listeners, the ones who've been with us on this whole deep dive into this alleged Dasuki Money Trail,
Yeah.
what's the takeaway? What do we want them to remember?
I think it's this. Corruption, it doesn't stop at borders. It's a global problem. We all need to be paying attention, you know? We can't be complacent and think it's just somebody else's problem.
We all have a role to play.
Absolutely. Supporting investigative journalism, demanding transparency from our leaders, just learning more about how this stuff works.
Knowledge is power. The more we know about these schemes, the better equipped we'll be to fight back.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you to think about all this, the implications of this case, and what role you might play in the fight against corruption, wherever you are in the world. Until next time, keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.